I want to start the question. Indeed, I have two equivalent, very much significant questions I articulate to ask you, and then I decided that there's another significant question, because what is the unique with Gaza to compare to other conflicts all over the world and historically as well? What is the unique of Gaza case right now, and somebody identify as a genocide, or somebody like, let's say, only Palestinian cause? What's your perspective about it, and what is the unique of Gaza genocide?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for Enstitü Sosyal for hosting me and having me. I'm really excited to be here. Hello to you guys in the back. I feel bad. My back is turned to you, so I'm going to try to shift and look at everybody. But it's an honor to be here, and I'm really excited to have this conversation about the double standards and hypocrisy in Western media. Hopefully we can have a more expansive conversation. And I'm really excited to engage in a Q&A with all of you, the more dynamic component of the conversation. So the first question is, what is the uniqueness around the genocide in Gaza? I don't want to speak for too long, but there's many sort of dimensions of this genocide that make it unique. The first of which is we all witness what's taking place on a real-time rolling basis in Gaza through our phones, right? Anybody watch the show Black Mirror? Show of hands, who knows the show Black Mirror, right? I was a big fan of the show, and if you haven't seen Black Mirror, I highly, highly encourage you to watch it, because the show is a very sort of prescient, forward-thinking, forward-looking dystopian take on where the world is going. And the show, although fiction, is tightly and intimately connected to what's happening in the world in real time. Look, the reality is that Gaza is not the first place or the first people that have been afflicted by a genocide. What sets it apart and makes it unique is that it is the first digital genocide in human history. And what do I mean by digital genocide? I mean digital genocide in two very critical manifestations. I'm here. The reason I'm in Istanbul is because the good sisters from Kadim invited me to address the role of women in AI, right? So by digital, we can first talk about the way in which algorithms have been used by killing machines that are deployed by the state of Israel. You guys might have heard of Lavender. You might have heard of Where's Your Daddy? These are new systems that the state of Israel uses to feed what are called kill lists, right? And these kill lists comprised of the names of individuals that the state of Israel is going after. So these new dystopian sort of cutting edge killing machines are digitally run to kill masses of people in very efficient order, right? So by virtue of going after one person, right, they're killing 150, 250 people collaterally and collectively through the use of digital algorithms. That's what makes it unique on that one end. The second front that makes it unique is the way in which we are experiencing and absorbing genocide on a daily basis. The fact that we can witness a massacre on our phones only seconds or minutes after it's taken place. The fact that we can see a young child who is amputated minutes after that child has lost his arm, his leg, or a limb. The fact that we can see mothers clenching onto their children, their babies, draped in white sheets, crying and mourning instantly after that child has been taken away from us. The fact that it's still me, like the fact that I haven't been on the ground in Gaza, but I've been entrenched in what's happening in Gaza as a consequence of my activism and what I've been doing. So many videos are so entrenched and etched in my head. One video I can raise as an example. I remember seeing a video of a father, right, who had lost his children. His home was bombed, and he was actually digging into the rubble, believing that he can uncover and unearth his children. What makes it unique above all is that we are no longer third parties distantly viewing and voyeuring into a genocide taking place in a distant land. We are active witnesses to a genocide, experiencing its very horror in a lucid, stark, and lurid way on a daily basis. And as a consequence of that, many of us have been unmade by this genocide in ways that are unprecedented in human history. Our minds are not designed as human beings, right, to take in, to witness this uncut, unfiltered imagery, this reel of genocide that takes place on a rolling basis, which makes this genocide more than just a tragedy afflicted against the people of Gaza, but in fact, a tragedy that's been afflicted, on a global community that's been traumatized in very serious ways.
And also, I want to ask my question, which is very much related to this case, because as we follow in our social media, phone, that genocide. At the same time, there are propaganda war between Israeli also and Palestinians, and Israelis are producing lots of documentaries, videos, and they are speaking. But at the same time, here, as a scholar and as a many audiences are witnessing the process with you, because you are international well-known scholar activist about that case. And what did you experience in your social media activism regarding this case? Because when I was writing the question, the artificial intelligence in that case in social media, and I was editing in ChatGPT, and it deleted everything about artificial intelligence. Even I just experienced a few minutes ago to edit my question. So what did you experience in social media?
A range of things. And sorry if I get worked up. I'm gonna try to be calm. It's hard for me to be calm when I discuss this issue, but among other issues. But look, I'll be candid, right? The irony is that I'm not a scholar specialized. I haven't been trained on the Palestinian conflict. That isn't my area of expertise, right? So I'm a law professor. My area of expertise is constitutional law, civil liberties, and Islamophobia broadly. But my work on Islamophobia has taken me to examine what's taking place in Gaza from an intellectual perspective, but also as just an individual person concerned with human rights and having family and friends in Gaza, but also family and friends in Lebanon, the region at large. That's also another sort of tentacle to my activism in the region. But to speak to your question about propaganda, look, the reality is that all wars have an undergirding propaganda war that's connected to them, whether it's the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union, whether it's World War II, whether it's war between Ukraine and Russia, these various actors, whether it's a state actor, militias or whatever, will capitalize on media outlets to essentially convey and disseminate their message. Today, what's distinct is now we live in a digital media space where social media is new terrain for propaganda wars, right? And I'll speak more closely to that because I think that's more sort of in line with the conversation that you guys want to have. But with regard to social media, there's a democratizing and liberatory element to it that makes it more inclusive than mainstream or legacy or traditional media. In the instance that, you and I can write a tweet or we can publish an Instagram post and we don't have to be connected to a newspaper or a news outlet for us to have our voice heard. I said this at a speech that I gave a couple of days ago. One thing that really marvels me is I'm a law professor. I spend the majority of my time reading books and researching and writing. I lead a very boring life, right? I write books and academic articles. My life is not interesting at all. Half my life is my wife yelling at me for doing something that I'm not doing or supposed to be doing. But to me, it's really, it's both absurd, but also kind of empowering that I can write a post on Instagram and it's viewed by 100,000 people, or I could share a reel and it's viewed by 2 million people. So social media has made the allocation of information far more democratic, right? That individuals like you and I or anybody else.
Any censorship?
And that's the second component of it is that, of course, because social media platforms like Meta are just like legacy media in that they have not only biases, that's a very sort of like benign way to classify it, but they have direct connections to states, and Meta specifically has direct connections to the IDF, right? I wrote this article earlier on in the genocide called Instagram versus Palestine, and I talk about the direct connection between Cyber Unit 8200 of the IDF, which is the surveillance unit of the IDF, which has a direct line to the leadership, the E-suite, to Meta, And they directly can tell people at Meta, hey, we need to flag this individual. We need to remove this individual. You guys might have seen that Sean King, for instance, was removed off Instagram because he was becoming very influential in mobilizing a lot of new supporters for Palestine. I myself have been heavily shadow banned and censored on Instagram. Posts removed all the time, various features disabled. I can't go on Instagram Live, for instance. So definitely, yeah. So social media, even though it's democratizing, still has the effect of being compromised and undermined by specific state interests and Zionist interests.
Yeah. And our session's second question is about our session's title, Two Tales of the West.
Yeah.
Suggests a dual nature in Western values. After witnessing the response to the Gaza crisis, what would you say is the true West in this context? As you know, like this true Islam was always discussed after the terrorist attacks in Western countries.
Yeah.
And right now, what is a true West regarding the historical and philosophical?
Okay, you guys
context?
look like a. Do you want the academic response or like the summary?
Both.
How long can I speak for?
You can speak. Yeah, we have.
Okay. So look, I mean, look, to be intellectually honest, I don't view the world in binaries, right? I don't view the world in Orientalist or civilizational sort of lenses. I think once we begin to do that, we sort of like capitulate and become sort of victim to the ways in which specific imperial forces want us to think. So the reality is that the West is not monolithic, right? So for instance, you've seen many Western nations, like Spain, for instance, take a really courageous and progressive stance on what's happening in Palestine. Ireland, which is situated in Western Europe, has been more courageous than 99% of Muslim and Arab states, and they are firmly in the West. So I think from an intellectual standpoint, we have to, just to be nuanced and meticulous thinkers, is to think beyond these really problematic imperial binaries that powers at the highest levels of the elite echelons of the state and corporations and media want us to think along, right? And so Islam, right? Islam and the Muslim community is by no means a monolith either, right? If that were the case, if we were a monolithic civilization, then Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Indonesia and Malaysia and Turkey and Egypt and Algeria would all be mobilizing and galvanized to free Palestine. Clearly not, that's not happening. Right. So to be frank with you, as a Muslim American, we have, for me specifically, I have to be critical of what the United States is doing, but I wouldn't be doing myself a real service if I wasn't critical of what Muslim states are not doing, right, as well. So, but once you think beyond that binary, you can be very sort of cautious and careful in identifying how specific institutions rooted in the West, which have oversized power, like legacy media outlets like the New York Times or the BBC or CNN, are so hegemonic in the way in which they craft and curate the discourse on Palestine, right? The fact that we were talking about earlier, I was speaking to the sister Helen, the fact that New York Times or the LA Times haven't called it a genocide. Right? That is an indictment on their journalistic integrity and ethics. When this has been the most genocidal case of genocide in modern history, right? How much evidence do you need of a genocide to make that case, legally speaking, right? And states, obviously, my state specifically, the United States has been the primary financier and facilitator and funder of this genocide. If not for the United States, right? And a specific black woman raising her hand 4 times at the United Nations to veto 4 ceasefire proposals, this genocide would have been stopped months ago. So we have to be precise in indicting and condemning institutions, but not being sloppy in condemning entire regions of the world in ways that perpetuate Orientalist, Islamophobic, and civilizational platitudes.
So when I come to your academic background as well, to discuss the international law, because you have written extensively on Islamophobia and law, human rights, could you discuss how international legal frameworks are selectively applied in case of Gaza? How do you see legal standards playing role in accountability and very selective enforcement most evident? Please extend this question to the role of global values in undermining universal human rights. If it destroyed and disappeared, is there any roadmap for human beings to find values for common ground for world? Because international law is established based on the human values. So after Gaza, what do you think about the international law, the human rights, these cases?
Yeah. So me and the sister in the car were talking about how, what would you say, sister? You said something along the lines of the myth of Western democracy, civilization, and the rule of law has essentially been exposed or has collapsed because nobody believes it anymore as a consequence of Gaza. Gaza has been a expose. It's been an indictment. It's been a revelation that all these principles that the West essentially stood for so long, the United States loves to brag about, oh, we're going to export democracy and liberal values and enlightenment to the world beyond, right? They always love doing it in the Arab world for some reason. My people are always the victims of Western democracy. When they say Western democracy, we know bombs are coming. So Gaza has been an expose of that in sort of bludgeoning global belief and confidence that the West stands for any of those things. But to be honest with you, that should have been exposed long before Gaza. We saw what happened in Iraq, for instance, right? And what distinguishes this genocide from what happened in Iraq is we didn't see what was happening in Iraq. We didn't see on our phones because social media wasn't advanced at that juncture. The sort of horror that Iraqis went through. 1.5 million Iraqis were killed over a span of 12 to 14 years. Afghans were killed in radical numbers.
And even today we are speaking about Hitler during the World War II, but at the same time, United States used nuclear bomb in Japan. Yeah. So if there's a social media, imagine it. 2 cities disappeared.
Yeah, and it's so so I teach constitutional law, but I have also taught civil areas of the law as well. There's in every area of the law, there's sort of an overarching theme of proportionality, right? That if a state engages in some form of violence, then specifically speaking, the state that is victimized has the right, the right to respond in equal proportion. But what we've seen, not only in this genocide, but in the example you cited with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is the West is always disproportionate in its response to violence, right? Even if you were to condemn October 7th as an act of terror, how many Israelis were killed on that day? Was it 1,600? 1,600 Israelis were killed, right? On October 7th. The response has been hyper disproportionate. If Israel would have responded by killing 2,000 members of Hamas, then they can maybe legibly say that we've responded in a proportionate way. But the fact that they've killed 50,000 to 200,000 people, right, highlights the disproportionality of it. But even more than that, it highlights the fact that specific individuals are valued and have value in the Western imagination, largely just for purposes of brevity. If you're white, blonde-haired, blue-skinned, and Jewish within the Zionist sort of landscape, you have value. But if you're Arab and Muslim, you don't have value. And that is why this discourse on Islamophobia is so salient and so critical, because Islamophobia as an epistemology, as a discourse, has essentially sort of justified the idea that Muslim lives are not only valueless, but are justifiably killed on account of them being linked to terrorists. Right? I mean, think about it. Israeli politicians, Netanyahu's not a dumb guy. He's a smart guy. He actually studied at MIT, right? For somebody who is that, and sometimes the most evil guys are really intelligent and diabolical, right? But the fact that a head of a state can condemn and classify an entire population of people, even young children, as terrorists, right? Demonstrates just how vile, right? And how potent this discourse of Islamophobia has been to justify the mass slaughter of people, not only in Gaza, not only in Iraq, but places like India, Myanmar, obviously. We see what's happening with Uyghur Muslims in China. So this case of global Islamophobia has been essentially exported by this baseline idea that Muslims are not only valueless, but are open for punishment, prosecution, and persecution on account of them being suspected terrorists.
But how do you see the South African impeachment process, the legal?
Oh, look, so yeah. So, I mean, look.
So do you think international law is going to apply in somehow, like in any case?
Yeah. So, how do I say this? I'm trying to be, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so I apologize if I'm meandering. You know, I want to be careful to say that. I want to say two things. Number one, it's critical to understand that the United Nations, the ICC, and the ICJ are essentially institutions that were set up by Western powers to further the interests of Western powers. There's a reason why the United States, the UK, in Russia and other, global hegemons have veto power on the Security Council level, right? It's a way in which they can leverage their global authority in ways that to maintain the status quo. But that's a critique that doesn't sort of entirely indict the value of the United Nations, the ICC, and the ICJ, because they can bring about progressive or productive value. Let me see if I can link what I want to say by raising up the work of a really important author. Anybody know who Derek Bell is? Derek Bell wrote a really important article in the Harvard Law Review called Interest Convergence Theory, right? The idea behind interest convergence is actors in power will only advance human rights or civil rights interests when it aligns with their economic and political interests, right? So if you have that alignment, then the United States or the UK or Russia or China, whatever global power we're talking about, the United States, let's talk about specifically, will advance that human rights interest because it actually furthers their economic or geopolitical interest. But if there's dissonance with that interest, then they're not going to address it. Right. And there's a series of examples. Ukraine is an example of that, for instance. Right. So we want to call Ukraine a genocide, and we want to highlight the fact that Ukrainians are, being invaded and denied their rights by Russians because we want Ukraine to maintain their alignment with NATO, and because maintaining Ukrainian sovereignty serves the interests of the United States and the UK. So we're going to uplift that issue. Yeah. Right. But Palestinian self-determination and identifying what's happening in Gaza as a genocide is actually oppositional to American interests.
The concept of self-determination started in the early 20th century by the Wilson Principles and League of Nations initiated. Yeah. So based on the League of Nations, they decided to end colonialism. And they initiated mandatory regimes. And after the Second World War, the colonialism is also supposed to end. But today we are discussing colonialism in Palestine as well. It is a settler colonialism.
Yes.
So how you define that process, and as you critically also examine the multilateral institutions, and still these concepts are they say that these concepts are end, but still we see the settler colonialism in Palestine.
Yeah. So there's a really important post-colonial scholar by the name of Aimé Césaire. Mm-hmm. He wrote a really important book called Discourses on Colonialism. And one of his observations in that book was that colonialism doesn't end, it just mutates and morphs. And I firmly believe in that, right? So even if you look at the post-colonial moment, for instance, when many of these African, Arab, Middle Eastern, South American nations were birthed anew, how can these nations have any sort of modicum of independence or freedom when their very borders were imposed upon them, right? The Lebanese didn't decide, hey, let's draw Lebanon in this fashion, right? The Palestinians and even the indigenous Jews who are native to that territory didn't decide to draw the nation state in that order, right? It was imposed by the French. It was imposed by the British. So even in the post-colonial moment, these new states had to essentially fend for themselves and construct new nations within the physical constrictions assigned to them by their European masters. And even more than that, right? These European masters, the French and the English specifically, because they were the most vile in the modern context, were still siphoning off the resources of these countries, making these countries entirely dependent on their foreign colonial master. And even if you think about colonialism, and we were talking about this I wish we would have recorded the conversation in the car. And I'm glad we had the conversation because it helps me think about what I want to talk about now. But even when you think about colonialism as a sort of existential phenomenon beyond the sort of like physical contours, the most destructive form of colonialism is psychological, in fact, right? The idea that, people of these formerly colonized countries not only feel inferior, but they still feel like this sort of subservience to their former colonial masters, even in the contemporary context. And my Arab brothers and sisters in places like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and across the Gulf are classic examples of that. Even though they're wealthy beyond belief, they still revere whiteness and specifically Britishness and Americanness. So colonialism remains a psychological sort of detriment as well. I want to respond to your question on South Africa, getting back to the ICJ and the UN. And South Africa deserves a lot of credit and reverence for what they've done, and even beyond the legal merits of the case. And if there's any lawyers or activists in the room, I would really push you all to read the petition that was filed by South Africa. It's a really masterfully well put together petition that makes a slam dunk case for genocide, in my opinion. And I've been to South Africa twice since the genocide began. But even beyond that, right? South Africa is a nation that can empathize with the struggle of the Palestinian people, having gone through apartheid. So their case in the ICJ was both symbolically and legally powerful. They were the ideal sort of protagonist to bring on the case, given the victimization that they experienced. So, and I say that to say that justice from the ICJ will come, in my opinion, because the case for genocide is so strong. But the unfortunate reality is that it'll be a delayed justice, and that it can't stop the genocide at a time when it needs to be stopped.
For the two-state solution, even we accept, or the multilateral institution is going to accept the two-state solution, but there isn't two-state, there isn't Palestinians in the certain territories within current territory.
Yeah, and I think that how can I say this? So there's going to be a global momentum, and it's already started, pushing for a two-state sort of, and I hate to use the word solution because it isn't a solution, because the remnants of land that'll be given to the Palestinian people will be so small, sparse, discontiguous, that it couldn't even be qualified as a bona fide state. When you think about, like, let's all of us have an intellectual exercise right now, right? How do you define a nation state? Like, what are the ingredients that make up a nation state? Good. Some kind of like physical territory, right? Sovereignty, independence.
Nation.
What else?
Nation.
Nationality. People can define nationality in line of, according to ethnicity, for instance, or in a place like the United States, it can be based on legal nationality, or a really diverse country. What else? What else do you need? Language, a common language, a unifying language. What else? Common history, but not nation, but a nation state is distinct from a nation, right? You need physical boundaries, right? You need some sort of like unifying charter, whether it be a constitution or something that legally defines what the nation state is. Second, you need an army, right? You need an army. You need an airport. You need institutions and sources and sovereignty, right? 3 or 4 of these things will be denied to the Palestinian people to not make it a full-fledged state, and at best a quasi-state. Israel is not going to allow the Palestinian people to have their own military, right? The territory is going to be fractured, fractious, discontiguous, right? In order to get from the West Bank to whatever remains of Gaza in this possible creation of a nation state, there's going to be Israeli checkpoints. So sovereignty is going to be administered and governed by the Israelis, right? Is Israel going to allow the Palestinian people to have their own airport? Probably not, for fear of terrorism. So they're going to administer, right, and essentially have overseeing power over sovereignty, physical boundaries, Another important ingredient of a nation state is that the people within the nation who are citizens have the ability to freely roam the nation, right? That is clearly going to be missing. So the two-state sort of construct that is on the horizon is by no means a solution, right? It's by no means a solution. So to me, the two-state solution is an oxymoron in terms.
And also, I want to continue that case again because but Palestinians have self-determination right. And based on the rule of law, international law, Palestinians should have the state as well. And at the same time, all these concepts based on the Western, let's say the Western hegemony in the world politics, world system.
Yeah.
At the same time, do you think that the Western states and decision makers has also psychologically justify Israel policies against Palestinians because of colonialism, their background? Sometimes I think that as well, because how they justify it? Because all these concepts are again the Western concepts. We are speaking about self-determination, rule of law, international law. At the same time, they are supporting Israel.
Yeah. Well, look, I feel like I've come from the United States. I've come a long way. I want to be honest with you guys, right? And I want to tell you what it is that I tell my students when I teach the law, right? We have to be, I see young people and I really appreciate their energy and their courage and their fight. Look, Western law is not about the values that are written on paper. It's about power, right? It's about who has the ability to enforce which rights will be applied and which rights won't be applied. I don't think Western powers, whether it be Western state powers in Washington, D.C. or in London or legacy media outlets, a two-part response to that. Number one, I don't think they actually care as a primary source of discussion about the veracity or sacredness of these values as much as to who can essentially enforce these values. Second, I think many of these Western institutions don't view Palestinians as fully formed human beings worthy of these values. I think Western racism, Western Islamophobia has created a sort of stratified ledger of who's worthy of these values and who isn't worthy of these values. And you could just look into American society to understand why that's the case. I mean, in the United States, for instance, if you are African American, you are a second or third class citizen, right? So if American rights and values are not being extended fully to citizens on account of race, why are we going to be naive to think that the United States is going to, assign human rights and civil rights values to brown people on the opposite side of the world? Right? So we have to stop being naive to believe that these values are going to be fairly enforced by Western institutions and Western powers who, again, are primarily concerned with the currency of power and expanding their power. And look, I mean, I want to be honest and also say something too, is that I want to talk about anti-Semitism, right? And I think there's been a real distortion of what anti-Semitism means. The fact that any criticism of Israel now has been sloppily conflated and classified as anti-Semitism. But there's genuine anti-Semitism in the United States, where across the country, they really hate Jewish people on account of them being Jewish.
But at the same time, there's a Christian Zionism as well.
There's evangelical Zionism, which is anti-Semitic.
It is. But
of course.
At the end, they are supporting also the Israel.
Which again speaks to how, those in power, and now speaking about Zionists, are happy, right, to embrace forms of bigotry, even anti-Semitism, if it serves their interests.
Yeah.
Right? Because what is the evangelical vision, right? These Christians believe that once the Jews return to Israel, they're all going to die, right? And the Messiah comes, and then it's the apocalypse.
But it's not a conspiracy theory. They believe it.
They believe
and they
it.
support it.
Yeah.
And the question...
Every religion have their own sort of beliefs on
but
Qiyamah.
But the key term is a power. So, in
Key
case of the power, we saw both U.S. presidential candidates emphasize their support for Israel. But at the same time, as Professor Marsheimer and Walt highlighted Israel lobby in the United States in their influential book. So in your view, does U.S. support for Israel stems solely from lobby influence of Israel, or Israel also an instrumental part of American hegemony policy in the Middle East? What is the intersection of two concepts, two cases?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's primarily the Israeli lobbying, specifically AIPAC, which has been. Look, you can think about.
Are they really powerful in the?
Yeah. So the American sort of like political landscape is very capitalistic, right? Lobby groups who are able to raise money and give money to politicians hold considerable sway over policy. And various Israeli institutions and lobby groups, specifically AIPAC, have been extremely influential in funding both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, to basically, advance a foreign policy that is favorable and very pro-Israeli. If you play the game in the United States, which gives me some optimism, to be honest with you, because Muslim Americans now are growing in number, becoming more educated, and becoming more sort of like literate with how to navigate the political process. And you guys saw in my home state of Michigan, which has a sizable Muslim and Arab American population, we were able to mobilize and not vote for Kamala Harris. Good news. Bad news is Trump got elected, which isn't the best news. But if you play the game well, that you can actually game the American governance animal in ways that favor the interest and the outcome that you want to bring about. I don't think, to be honest with you, that Israel serves genuine American regional interests anymore. I think it might have at one point, but in many respects, if not for the Israeli lobby, you can make the argument that Israel actually weakens American interests in the region. The United States has strong allies in the region in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in the UAE. In fact, Israel has become a big sort of financial burden for the United States. $6 billion a year. During this genocide, I think we've given $40 to $60 billion a year. And you have to understand, I think people outside of the United States think that the United States is this uber wealthy country. There's a lot of wealthy people in the United States. There's also a lot of poor people. And one thing that's happened in the United States, especially with the right, there's a burgeoning movement called the America First movement, who have become very critical of Israel because they're like, my school is breaking down. My roads in my neighborhood are becoming dilapidated. A hurricane just hit my city and I can't get my home to be reconstructed, but you're sending $10 billion to Israel? Right. So it's important to understand that I think people think that the United States is firmly allegiant to Israel, but things are shifting.
Really?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. And also you mentioned that in Michigan, there's a Muslim community who were supporting Kamala Harris. And do you think...
And Trump.
Yeah. Do you think, is there any the democratic, the public voice has any power to politicians and decision makers? Because in Western countries, in London, millions of people marched against Israel genocide. In the US as well, in many Western countries. And in Germany, people cannot outspokenly mention about this case. But at the same time, you can see the public, the Western public is against this genocide. But it's not game-changing for the decision makers. So how it damaged the democratic values, the rights and principles?
Well, this is the fundamental paradox of democracy, specifically in Western democracies, is that governments are theoretically supposed to be beholden to their constituents, right? The citizens, and if the masses of citizens have become pro-Palestinian, even if they're not pro-Palestinian, right? If they're just like, hey, why are we supporting a genocide? Why are my tax dollars going to a foreign country, right? But the fact of the matter is that Western democracies, specifically the United States, are more beholden to these lobbies that we're talking about, right? These politicians want to get reelected, so they want to make sure that AIPAC gives them the maximal donation so they can campaign and, send out marketing ads to make sure that they're reelected in the future. So that is a fundamental sort of encumbrance and taint on democracy that needs to be shifted. But look, I think there's lots of reason for optimism, right? Because I think that, for those of us who have when you're born, I'm Lebanese, Egyptian, and Palestinian. So for me, as soon as you're born, one of the first things you say when you're a kid is you learn about Palestine, right? When I was a young kid, my father would read me poems from Ghassan Kanafani and Mahmoud Darwish. And when I was, a teenager, we'd read books from Edward Said and Emil Habibi. So we were educated at a very young youth to be very pro-Palestinian. So I've always been, active on the Palestine issue my entire life. But I think that one thing that's a positive outcome from this genocide is the degree of pro-Palestinian sentiment is unprecedented on a global scale. That if things hold up, right, this new sort of groundswell of support for the Palestinian cause, God willing in the future, inshallah, manifest
Inshallah.
and translate in the way policy is being crafted.
It is last question also, and then we will start the Q&A session. But my last question is about, you are very much optimistic, but at the same time, the Gaza case also damaged, destroyed, and disappeared all values in the world right now.
Yeah.
And what we are experiencing in Ukraine, what we are experiencing in Far Asia, in Africa, in many places in the world, they're like a conflict zones. And in Syria, for instance, more than 10 years.
Yep.
And in Iraq, there's an interwar, and civil war in Iraq as well. So, do you still optimistic? If there isn't any human values in these conflicts, do you think there is any pathway to human for this conflicted period?
I think that's a philosophical
maybe
question.
Gaza can lesson us as well, can teach us.
Yeah, I think it can teach us. I think there's been so much, inspiration to come out of Gaza, and I can talk about that for days, right? I mean, today I woke up in the morning and this young activist in Gaza painted on the wall, Khaled Beydoun, we applaud your work and you're a voice for us. So, small things like that are inspiring, or waking up every Friday and seeing Palestinians, collect for Jumu'ah prayer around destroyed mosques. That's inspirational, right? The fact that people who are experiencing genocide can still pick themselves up and pray while experiencing famine. Ramadan this last year was very difficult, right? Understanding that we were observing the holy month at a time when Palestinians were denied not only food, but denied water. I mean, you guys saw images of haram, Palestinians were eating animal feed, and some of them were eating grass during the holy month of Ramadan. So when you see that, it breaks you. But what I try to tell young people is we have to stop looking. It's a form of sort of existential capitulation and colonization. Always look at the West and their values as being the North Star and the compass for how we should live and for what is right. And I think it's high time for us to look within, and to look, as a Muslim. To me, the most important thing about who I am is that I'm a Muslim, and we look at the values that we have that are etched deep into our faith, right? And not only religious convictions, but ideas around social justice, ideas around if anybody is oppressed, even if they're non-Muslim, it's our duty, it's our obligation to speak up on their behalf. So what makes me optimistic, and less so optimistic, but what makes me hopeful is that, Allah puts us in positions of privilege. Look, we're sitting in a beautiful room in a safe building having a conversation when I've had 13 cousins killed in Lebanon over the course of these last 2 months. Whereas one stroke of, coincidence, I could be there and they could be here. So it's not a question of hope or pessimism. It's more a question of, Allah assigns you to stations, and when Allah puts you in a specific circumstance, it becomes your obligation to act in a way that can in some way better somebody else's life.
Thank you, Professor Khaled. And also, thank you, esteemed guest, because today is really cold and you came here on Sunday. And at the same time, we have very, very distinguished guest today, Miss Helen. She was with Ayşenur Ezgi in Palestine, and she was in field also last week. And before Q&A session, if you share your experience there, we would be very much happy.
I'm an introvert, so I don't like talking in public. But what I saw in the West Bank, starting with the execution of Ayşenur Ezgi, I gave my statement to the Palestinian authorities I was interviewed by media, and I only did so at the condition that I was anonymous. But I realised after watching the courage and the suffering of so many Palestinians just in the West Bank that I had no right to be afraid, and I had to speak out. So since coming here from Palestine, that was my commitment. Aishinal Egi was right beside me on my left when she was executed. She was shot by a sniper at the Beta protest. For those who don't know, the Beta protest happens every Friday after Jummah prayers. It's in a park, almost at the top of a hill, overlooking the area that these villagers had their land stolen from them, and beautiful Israeli condos have been built on their land. So every Friday they pray. Old men pray. We sat under the tree with them before prayers. Aishinor and I and a few other volunteers, we shared coffee and dates. They said their prayers, and within minutes the old men had left and the young boys stood on the road ready to protest the fact that their land was stolen. Within seconds, there were tear gas canisters fired into the group. My Aishinor and I were very naive. We were in shock that within seconds we'd got across the road into the protection of the olive grove, what we thought was protective, and they shot first live ammunition that ricocheted and hit a Palestinian boy in the leg. We retreated in the grove. We were standing behind an olive tree thinking everything had calmed down. The boys were still bravely shouting on the road, but we were away from them with our cameras. That was our role as international volunteers, was to try, and as you spoke about the power of social media, that was our role, to try and deter violence. There already had been 17 Palestinians shot and killed at that protest in the past 2 years. And 2 weeks earlier, an international volunteer had been shot in the leg. There was a deliberate campaign. The Israeli government had set up a task force to try and target international volunteers. The reason being, going back to your point earlier about the power of social media, that was our role, to try and record what they were doing, whether it was their harassment, the psychological trauma caused by intimidation through the use of guns and tear gas, the stealing of property when we were there. I've seen young men beaten up by soldiers or taken away, detained and beaten up. This was constant. This was daily. So after the shooting of Aishinor, I'd only been in Palestine a few days, as had Aishinor. We went to the hospital where her body was. There were mountains of journalists and photographers and officials there waiting to capture every reaction to her death from us. And at that point, I was not aware that in the same morgue of Aishinor was a 13-year-old Palestinian girl shot dead in a separate incident by an Israeli soldier. And the parents would have been grieving at the same time we were, but there weren't any journalists there to report to the world the death of this young girl. Now, that was just my first introduction to what ended up being 6 weeks of seeing this type of trauma repeated over and over again in the West Bank. So there were days where the olive grove harvesting started on the 10th of October. Many volunteers would come in from a number of different organisations, again armed with nothing but cameras our phone cameras, most of us had, and hoping to do nothing more than to deter war crimes with our cameras. So in one incident, you talk about hope. I have no right to be to lose hope. I have no right to be afraid anymore, because what I saw from Palestinian people there was, like, on this one day in an olive grove, there was a whole village there pulling, and I learnt to pull olives off a tree, which I'm very proud to say. We were harvesting olives, and then in the distance we could see the Israeli occupation force advancing closer to the villages. Now, we know their lives at risk. 2 days after that, at another olive grove where we weren't present, a Palestinian woman, aged 57, was shot and killed harvesting olives. This is life in the West Bank. We know whatever happens in Gaza is going to happen in the West Bank. Israel is an unchallenged force. It is a regime that has unfettered power, unfettered weapons, unfettered income. We have governments like my own, the Australian government, who set up almost $1 trillion contract with Elbit, an Israeli weapons company, only a number of months ago. So we're seeing a hypocrisy. We're seeing our Prime Minister and our other ministers saying, don't bomb citizens and don't bomb Rafah, but here's some weapons for you. And we're seeing that from the US as well. So when we talk about what's going to stop this, that will stop it. And I like your point about not being sloppy in our thinking about the West versus the East, or Muslims versus Jews. There are important differences to note here, and that there are many young people across the world. We've seen that in the universities. I'm at a university in Australia. We have seen the young people be our conscience, and I believe we have to, as older people. That's what motivated me to get over there. I'm a grandmother. I shouldn't be doing this at this stage of my life, but we're seeing young people get killed, whether they're paramedics, health workers, volunteers, but most of all the children. Like, we know these figures. I hate quoting them, but they're enormous. And if it takes 2 years for the International Court of Justice to determine if there's genocide occurring, then we haven't got very intelligent judges. If we look at the numbers alone and the percentage that a children, Save the Children Fund, Save the Children NGO, have just said that 10 children a day in Gaza are losing a limb. 10 children a day. And there are 20,000 children missing. In Australia, where I come from, if one child goes missing, we have ads everywhere. We get messages on our phone from the police that one child is missing. We're talking about 20,000 children missing. So there is this hypocrisy in my country, and there's hypocrisy in the US. But most of all, the hypocrisy is in Israel. How many soldiers that pulled us over, and they were from Texas, they were from Canada, they were from Ukraine, and the violence of the settler soldiers. The settlers were equipped with uniforms, guns, and even more power. So they're coming onto farms. The settlers are bulldozing olive trees. And one more message of hope. So this incident in the olive grove, my last point, is when they saw the soldiers advancing, there was at first, particularly amongst people like me, we're kind of nervous. I have had guns inches from my stomach that I ended up being able to stand up against. But this is a village with children there. And I held a child that was trembling, 4 years of age, at the sight of soldiers. So what did the Palestinians do? What do you think they did? They kept pulling the olives off the tree, and they are laughing and started singing. So we've got no right to give up on Palestine because the Palestinians are not going to give up on their land.
Thank you, Helen, for your contribution. Is there any question to Professor Khaled Beydoun?
Thank you, Brother Khaled, for the very good presentation. And thank you, Sister Helen. And I hope we hear more from you. Thank you for your courage. How do you feel what's going to happen next is the question. When I was taking international law, our professor, Dr. Michael Nuanzi, put the international law book at the desk and asked me to read the first page. The first page read at the beginning, law is politics. Then at the end of the semester, after we went through all these cases, international cases, what would happen, who has the right to, for instance, sue in the international waters if a UN, someone who is a certain country's citizen but works for the UN gets killed in a UN mission, who may, who can open a case, where can the case be open? These kinds of questions. After solving all those, going through all those issues at the end of the semester, he made me read out loud in front of the class that sentence, law is politics. I appreciate the fact that you talked about different people all over the world. Helen is a very good example, maybe in the countries even that support Israel, going against this horrible genocide. But what do you see happening next? I mean, I know we can't tell the future, Allahu Alam, but what do you see from the international law point of view, let's say in 10 years? Hopefully by then this will have come to an end. There won't be any more people dying. But how do you see it from an international law point of view? And then what will our grandchildren, how do you feel, what will they be reading about in history books about this period?
Yeah. No, great questions, right? So, one thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't with the earlier questions is, look, it's clear, it's very important to understand the nature of the regime that is presiding over Israel at this juncture, right? So it's a coalition between Netanyahu and the religious right, represented primarily by the likes of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who believe staunchly in this vision of greater Israel. So when this genocide was unfolding, I realized that the siege of Gaza was only the first phase of a much broader, protracted vision on the part of this government, right? So they are really invested at this juncture to capitalize on the opportunity to expand this idea and vision of greater Israel. That is why they pushed into South Lebanon, where they're currently invading the south and carpet bombing on a daily basis cities and towns and villages across Lebanon. And the second sort of phase is occupation of South Lebanon in a new form of colonialism, not in the form of, annexing Lebanon as a nation state, but regime change, hopefully bringing down Hezbollah and then implement a government in Lebanon that will be essentially a client complicit state that will, basically support the Zionist vision and the Abraham Accords. And the next step would be Syria. They're bombing Syria every day in the hopes of bringing down the Assad regime to weaken Iran's sort of arc or Shia crescent into the region. So if this continues, right, in Israel, and whenever we talk about Israel, it's important to talk about the United States because they are co-conspirators in the genocide, but also the expansion. But a lot can change, right? There's a lot of variables, and obviously the primary variable now is the election of Donald Trump, right? So Donald Trump is, by every measure, a staunch political Zionist. I don't think Trump is an ideological Zionist in the way that Biden was. I think Trump is a businessman. He's going to do what favors his interests, but he has very staunch Zionists as part of his administration. But he's unpredictable, right? So that's one variable that's sort of reintroduced that can really shift what can happen next. Another thing that can happen next is within the state of Israel, right? So Zionism is far more heterogeneous than we think it is. There are sort of like moderate and liberal Zionists who don't buy into the vision of greater Israel, right? And there's much opposition against the Netanyahu regime within the state of Israel that if Netanyahu and this coalition government is ousted, then the sort of expansion, genocidal and imperial expansion of Israel in the region could be stopped. So that's another possibility. Then there's global momentum from the likes of many countries around the world who want to bring about a two-nation sort of resolution in ways that'll at least give the Palestinian people a quasi-state or crumbs of what resembles a state. But my guess, so this is kind of my working sort of guess of the short term, is I think Trump, when he comes into office, because Trump he can't afford war in many regards, right? Financially, and because a considerable segment of his base is genuinely anti-war, is going to give the Netanyahu regime a timeline that, hey, I give you a month to do what it is you have to do, but after a month, it all stops. And then he transitions to sort of expanding the Abraham Accords that he spearheaded during his first term in office. So that is the short term. But the sister Helen said something really important, that even if there's a two-state sort of resolution, that the Palestinian people are not going to stop, right? Every precedent of revolution and indigenous resistance, we were talking about the Algerian Revolution earlier on in the car, is Native people don't stop fighting until they claim their land. And that is going to be a contiguous sort of struggle and theme that for as long as the Palestinians are foreclosed access to their rightful ownership of the land, there's going to be resistance of some kind, right? What are our grandchildren going to think? I think that, inshallah, they're going to think that people in this room are on the right side of history because we were rightfully against a genocide. But there are a whole host of people and characters and politicians and pundits who have been on the wrong side of history, and they're going to be viewed in the same way that, sort of sanitizers and proponents of the Holocaust were on the wrong side of history.
Thank you. And Professor Khaled has another program, so I will have just 2 questions more, and then we will
I think this is my
finalize the
last
session.
program. I don't know. Inshallah, I don't have another one. I'm tired.
I don't know. I had a message, that's why.
I hope not. I hope the next program's dinner.
Okay. So,
There's no other. Okay.
yeah. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Halinur. I'm an industrial engineering student from Marmara University. And also, I just want to huge thanks to Mrs. Helen, because I really want to, you almost made me tear up with your speech. And I just want to say huge thanks to you and the dear professor. So what I want to ask you is, what do you think Trump's next move will be when he takes the power? I mean, he kind of favors Israel because his son-in-law is Jewish, and in his latest administration, in his previous administration, he recognized Jerusalem as the Israel's capital and moved the embassy. But he also doesn't want to get involved in the Middle East that much. He wants to get U.S. troops back from the region. So what do you think his next move will be towards this genocide and the whole conflict?
Yeah. Man, look, Trump is a funny character, right? I think that, again, like I just mentioned, he's very unpredictable and mercurial. And even more than that, he's very egotistical. Right. I think so. It's very important to think about the ways in which presidential terms work in the United States. Right. So the first term, when the president is first elected, their primary objective is to get reelected. So they're kind of constrained by that desire to sort of negotiate and navigate within the political constrictions of reelection. Right. Now, Trump is not restricted at all. This is his final term, unless he drafts a new constitution and gives himself a third term, which is not entirely unforeseeable, I guess. But part of me And I've studied Trump through the lens of my research of Islamophobia, and I've noticed how Trump rhetorically says one thing, but then will shift in ways that want to make him sort of stand up as a hero. Part of me thinks that Trump's egomaniacal sort of personality wants to be the American president that brings about some sort of resolution in the region, even if it's entirely unfair to the Palestinian people, right? So I think that's a stark possibility within the rubric of the Abraham Accords, right? So there's been some really important shifts too. Like, I'm no fan of MBS, right? But MBS and Saudi Arabia were fully on board with the Abraham Accords until the genocide. And MBS, who's very Trump-like in nature, he's kind of like the Arab Trump in many ways, right? They're business first, right? They're entirely transactional. But MBS said something really important that didn't get enough media coverage. He said, I'm not going to sign up to the Abraham Accords until the Palestinians have their own state, right? And that was direct communication to Trump and in my opinion, Saudi Arabia is a far more valuable ally to the United States than Israel is, right? So if MBS is holding true to his word, then Trump is going to have to compromise and concede and render some form of a Palestinian state to meet that criteria that MBS has laid forward. Again, this is just sort of like speculation and sort of like a hypothesis that I have. Things can entirely shift because Trump is unpredictable. But to be honest with you, I think that that's actually a better option than the very predictable disciplined Zionism of the Democratic Party, specifically under Harris and Biden.
Thank you. Kemal Hoca. So, yeah, all question from the left-hand side, so another one is right.
My question is simple. Is there a systematic effort to document what is happening on the ground, the actual genocide itself, the resistance shown by the Palestinians, and maybe as important as that, the complicity of countries and institutions within countries?
Yeah.
Are this all being documented to be able to write a history of this whole thing such that it becomes an example for future generations? Is that being done by either persons or institutions? That's my question.
Oh, yeah. I think that, again, like one thing we didn't mention is, like, look, what's distinct about this genocide is for the first time in modern history, you've had indigenous Palestinians giving a firsthand daily accounting of what's taking place on the ground in ways that are transformative, right? The fact that we have people like Mu'taz, Azaiza, and Wael El-Dahdouh, and I was with Bilal Khaled the other day, who's here in Istanbul and was at the same conference we were at. These individuals were enduring and experiencing genocide while simultaneously documenting what was taking place for the entire world to see. So people like me, on my social media platforms, I have a saved memory and saved archives of what happened for 401 days straight. I wrote a book, right? My book called Eyes on Gaza, Witnessing Annihilation is coming out in February, right? Basically sort of like cogently accumulating all this information. So the collection of history is by no means the problem, which is why social media has been a very sort of important development with regard to this genocide. But parallel to that is the sort of crime of legacy media and the assassination of journalists on the ground, right? 187 journalists at least have been killed in Gaza. Al Jazeera has been classified as a terror group by the state of Israel. So there's this two-front war going on in Gaza where the state of Israel is one of my best friends who was a journalist. I talked about him at the earlier event that I was at today. El Mayadeen, a Lebanese news outlet, was killed 6 days into the genocide. Issam Abdullah, good friend of mine. But even though they've been able to suppress legacy and traditional media in ways that, that are in concert with the ways in which media has been suppressed historically, you can't entirely suppress digital media, and this genocide has highlighted that. So very important histories will be written, right? My book, inshallah, will be one of them. But, there's a book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, right, which isn't a history of genocide in Gaza, but really prominent African-American writer and scholar. His book, The Message, which is resonating deeply, specifically with non-Muslims and non-Arabs in the United States, given his role in the Black Lives Matter movement, talks about what's happening in the West Bank, where Sister Helen was, in terms of apartheid, right? So there's important intellectual development and knowledge coming out. So that's not a concern that I have.
Yeah, but the examples you gave is actually the act of genocide being done on the. What I'm saying is also the complicity. What's happening in the parliaments of other countries, the decisions they have taken. The example you give in Australia today, what they did to you, for example, all of this combined. Yeah, that's important because that will be seen as example for the future generations. How the Western world is behaving, their entire ethical standards will be grounded, right? If this is done correctly.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very important.
Can I comment on that? Just on Australia's complicity, I know I was at an online meeting today with the Australian Palestinian Advocacy Network. One of the workshops we attended some months ago was about Pine Gap in Australia. It's in the centre of Australia. There's a massive US military base, which is, co-managed by the Australian government with a massive satellite system there that is used to send to the US, who send it to Israel to help them with their targeting. You mentioned their incredible ability to target specific people. So there are people in Australia collecting the evidence of that complicity, and also in terms of collecting evidence, just some very real examples I have is the international volunteers that I worked with. We were doing that. We were collecting evidences of the illegal outposts being built on every single day there, sending it through to lawyers to start collating that evidence. And on top of that, I think I mentioned earlier, there are many examples across the world, but even in Ankara, a group of women lawyers had interviewed children in Ankara from Gaza. Again, that evidence is being compiled and used and will be used when Israel have to face up to their war crimes.
Thank you. And thank you for coming today
thank you.
and contribute. And also, Ms. Selim, thank you for coming and share your emotions and experiences in the field. So please join me to applaud. Thank you so much.